I'm now going to be installing the Renderman plugin for Houdini. Renderman is one of the most used renderers within the film industry. Although the term Renderman doesn't specifically refer to an individual renderer, instead Renderman is actually a standard and it defines a set of features which are required to build a renderer, and this used to revolve around the Renderman shading language, and the core of these features were the Renderman shading language as well as the raise algorithm. So the term Renderman can be ambiguous, as it has in certain points of time referred to a number of renderers. This standard is not as widely used as it was previously. There used to be a number of renderers that were built off the Renderman standard. However, there are numerous standards which have been added since then. One of the big standards which has been added is the Open Shading Language, which was created by Sony for Arnold, and this is now generally used as a shading language instead of the Renderman shading language. So for example, renderers like 3Delight, which used to be a Renderman compliant renderer, now use the Open Shading Language instead. So while Renderman used to refer to a class of renderers, that is not really common now, as Renderman now refers essentially to Pixar's rendering engine, which has also always been named Renderman. In this case, the renderer that I am installing will be Pixar's Renderman. This is a reasonably expensive renderer. This renderer is aimed at large studios, and it's aimed at large productions. It does, however, come with an individual free license, where you can use it for free for non-commercial use. To use the free license, you will need to have created an account, and you will need to be logged into this account in order to use this. In the menus on the Renderman page, we'll have the options Try or Buy, and I'll navigate to this page. On this page, we'll have two main sections, one for professional options and one for non-commercial options. Here, I'll be trying the non-commercial license, so I'll click on the Try for Free button. As stated previously, you will need to be registered and logged on in order to do this. We'll then come to a page which has more information about the non-commercial download. Here there'll be a free to try button and we'll need to click on this. You will then need to fill in some personal information, which I'm not going to do now for obvious reasons. Eventually you should get a download link and you should be able to download a version of Renderman. I have already done this. In this case the downloader is for Windows and it is an MSI file, so I can navigate to the file where I have the installer and I'll install Renderman. We'll have the introductory page and here I'll select Next. This will be followed by the user license agreement. This is something which we should actually read, but people hardly ever read this. And the Renderman agreement is actually a very short agreement. I'm going to accept the license agreement. We then have the option to select our default installation folder, and this is where the Renderman renderer is going to be installed. We should know the location of this folder, as we will need to specify this folder later. When using Windows, the default installation will be under the Program Files folder, under the Pixar folder. And in this case, I'm going to be using the default installation location. So I'll press Next. And then I'll have the final installation confirmation. And to install Renderman, I'll then press Install. We'll now need to wait for the initial installation to finish. When using plugins for third-party renderers, we should note that Houdini can be very picky about installations. If we're not going to be able to compile the renderer ourselves, we'll have to find a version of Houdini which is compatible with the renderer. In most cases, these tend to be production builds. We will need to take that into account later when it comes to attempting to use the plugin for Houdini. So the base installation should now be finished and I get a finished menu. I also get a pop-up for the actual installation of the renderer itself. So I can close the initial installer and now need to work within the Renderman installer itself, which will install the specific versions which we need. And here I'll need to log into the Renderman account. I'm also going to specify that I'm going to download the license and the application. I'll fill in my details and then I'll press Next in order to install. We should now be presented a list of installation options. And here we have two installations listed. The first is the Renderman Pro server. I do need this even though I don't have a professional license, as this is actually the Renderman renderer. The second option is Renderman for Blender. This is not something I'm currently using, so I will need to look for other options. In order to do this, I'll activate the Show All toggle. This will give me a number of additional installation options, and the Renderman for Houdini installation is the second one from the bottom. I should note that this is a Windows 11 installation and I'm using Windows 10. This should not cause any actual issues, but you can never be sure. So I'm going to install Renderman for Houdini as well as the Pro Server option. With these two options selected, I can press Next. The download and installation process should now begin. We'll need to wait for this to finish. In this case, my download is very fast because I can accelerate it by 2000 times through video editing. If the download completes correctly, we should have a success screen. We should then be able to press the Finish button in order to close the installer. The renderers which I'm going to be using should now be downloaded and installed. I now want to set it up so that Houdini can actually locate them. In order to use these, we will need to register these plugins. There are a couple of ways to register plugins within Houdini. I'm going to work with the newer system, which is slightly simpler, and this is called the package system. For information on how this works, we can navigate the Houdini help, and on the bottom of the main page we'll have a section called Houdini Packages. For my installation, I'm going to be performing this in the default location. However, if you're working with servers, you may need to have a custom installation path, and for that I would recommend reading this section, as the package system has a lot of flexibility, but that kind of setup is far beyond the scope of anything which I'm capable of doing within these videos, as I simply would not have the hardware to do it. As stated earlier, I'm going to be looking for the default installation folder, and it will be stored within a directory which is called the User Preferences directory. We can find this directory using an environment variable, and this environment variable will be Houdini User Pref directory. To see where this folder is, I'm going to open a Python window. Here I'll use the Houdini library, and then I'm going to look for the get environment variable function. This should be get env. This will take a string argument, and this string will be the name of the environment variable, but it should not be preceded with the dollar symbol. And this should give me my user preferences directory, and this is one of the main locations where plugins should be registered. There are other places which you can register plugins, but this is the easiest of these locations to work with. And what we'll be looking for is the folder beneath this folder, which is called Packages. I can now work with these folders. Here I have the Renderman installation. This is under the Program Files folder, under Pixar. I've also opened the User Preferences folder. The first of these folders is Renderman for Houdini. I can enter this folder, and there are a number of subfolders here. Almost all of these subfolders are numbered. There is one exception to the numbered folders, and this folder is called Packages. I can look at the first numbered folder, which in this case is 3.7. Within this there is another numbered folder, and this is called 19.5.805. This is a Houdini version number. This would be a supported Houdini release, so if you're using a 19.5 version of Houdini, this is the build that you'd want to use. If I look at the newest folder, which will be version 3.11, here we'll see three versions of Houdini. These will be 20.5.278, 20.5.410, and 20.5.445. These are the builds which I'd want to be using. 0.278 was the initial release if I remember correctly, and 0.410 and 445 are both production builds. In this case I'll be working with production build 0.445. Trying to use other builds may not work, or they may have issues. This is one of the drawbacks of Houdini having daily builds. However, in actual production this shouldn't really be a big deal, as you generally should work with older builds in any case, and you should only ever rarely use daily builds if you have a specific bug fix that you need. So we can check these folders for the builds which you can work with. There are other ways of identifying what builds we can use, which we will see a little bit later. But first we're going to work on the plugin setup, and for this I'll need to enter the packages folder. Here we'll have a JSON file, and this file will be called Renderman for Houdini. This file is what is going to register the plugin for Houdini. I'm going to copy this file, and then I'm going to navigate to the packages folder in the user preferences directory. If you do have a brand new installation of Houdini, there may well not be a packages folder yet, in which case you could either create a new folder or copy the entire Renderman folder. In this case I only need to copy the file, as I do have a number of packages which I'm using. The majority of these are my own plugins. However, before I try to use this file, I'm going to open it. Here I'm using Visual Studio Code, although you could use any text application. Using a text editor which does do syntax highlighting, however, can be very useful, and in this case it is. This JSON file essentially contains everything that Houdini needs to register the plugin, and the majority of these are purely environment variables containing folders. And what we want to do is make sure that all of these folders match up correctly with the installation folder. So here I have the folders in the Pixar installation, and we want to make sure that all the paths in the JSON file match up here. This file is generated when we install Houdini, and most of the information here should be correct. Here all the installation folders do actually match. There are two initial environment variables. The first is Renderman tree, and this contains the path to the Renderman Pro server. This is followed by a second environment variable. This environment variable is more relevant in my case. This will be the path for the Renderman for Houdini plugin. This will be followed by a dictionary entry which is storing a list, and we can identify the list because it is between square braces. This is a list of all the Houdini versions which are currently supported in the version of Renderman which I installed on my computer. This begins with the newest version, and it ends with the oldest version. The newest of all of these is actually a bit of a placeholder, as it is for an unreleased version of Houdini, but it is currently referencing the production version 20.5.445. This is followed by the Python versions, and these are the Python versions which are supported by Houdini, and we actually have a problem with this installation script here. Here I'm getting an incorrect syntax warning at the end of this list. In this case, the installation has placed a comma at the end of the list. The final entry of the list should not have a comma, and if I look at the warning here, I should see the error trailing comma. This is a syntax error and it will prevent this plugin from registering within Houdini. This is being automatically generated, and currently this will be incorrect every single time I try to install Renderman, so I will need to fix this and I will need to remove this comma. Essentially, we want to make sure that whenever we have square braces, we remove any extra commas which are placed before the final square brace. I can save the updated file. I can then restart Houdini in order to test this. Houdini will need to be restarted in order for the plugin to actually be registered. When I start up Houdini, I get a warning. This is a warning about OCIO, which is a library for color management. This is used for color management for rendering in order to maintain correct color over multiple different devices. This warning is about loading the ACES color spaces. It's basically saying that the version of our configuration file cannot be loaded by the version of OCIO that Renderman is using. I'm not going to try to fix this yet. It will not really affect the initial renders. I am going to show you how we can connect to a custom ACES profile. I'll do that after I've tested Renderman, but I will not go through the actual ACES setup. Before I do anything else, I'm going to inspect the packages. I'll do this by opening a new pane. I'm going to look under the Inspector submenu here, and I want to open the Package Browser tab. This will list all of the packages which are being loaded within Houdini. I have a number of my own packages which are being loaded, so we'll need to scroll down till I find Renderman. The names of the packages will match the names of the JSON files, so the package that I'm looking for will be Renderman for Houdini. Here we should see all the environment variables that are being created within the JSON file. I can double check all these paths and these all appear to be correct at the moment. We should now also have a drop-down menu for Renderman. There are a number of options here and I will not go into any of them now. These are not essential for basic rendering, so don't need to test any of this yet. So now I can test to see if anything will render. I will add a geometry node to the scene and I'll enter it, and I'll add a rubber toy node to the geometry node. I can then return to the root of the SOP network, and here I'll add a LOP network. I'm going to import the geometry with the SOP import node, and here I can reference the rubber toy. When I select the viewport dropdown, I should now be able to specify a number of options for Renderman. Of these, I cannot really use the GPU acceleration, as I do not currently have an NVIDIA GPU, and this does rely on the CUDA libraries. I should still, however, be able to work with the RIS renderer, as well as the standard XPU renderer and the XPU CPU renderer. If I look at the output, I should see statistics for the renderer, and I should be able to use most of these rendering options. So now I have Renderman installed and Renderman is rendering, which means that I do have a basic working setup for Renderman. I do, however, still have the OCIO error that I need to fix. I'm going to fix this now, and I'm going to fix this by adding a custom profile for OCIO. So when we start Houdini, we will get this error, and this is because the OCIO config is not being registered correctly. In some of the previous versions of Houdini, it was possible to specify a specific OpenColorIO config, and usually this would be set with an ACES config. In the most recent versions, however, the config is set by default, and we can then modify the config. This is now located under the Edit menu, under OCIO Settings. And normally this would allow us to update the OCIO config. However, at the moment, we'll currently get a repeat of the error for this config, so we will not be able to fix this within the Houdini interface. And instead, I'm going to fix this by updating the package file. What I want to do in this package file is reference a custom OpenColorIO config, and the best idea would probably be to place this OpenIO config in a separate location. For the moment, however, I'm going to use the base ACES configs within the Renderman setup. So we'll need to find these default configurations, and these will be found within the Renderman Pro Server folder. This will be under the library folder, and within this folder there will be an OCIO folder. Within this there are going to be two ACES folders, and here I'll be referencing the ACES 1.3 folder. Within this folder there will be a config file called config.ocio. I can now update the rendering for Houdini package file to use this OCIO for the OCIO configuration. Here I'm going to update the environment variables, and I'll do this at the end of all the existing environment variables. The environment variables will be specified between a pair of square braces, and with the coloring which I have here, these are both purple. This will be done following the final curly brace, and this will be done with a comma, which will be followed by two more curly braces. The environment variable will be specified between quotation marks, and this will be entirely in capital letters. This will be OCIO. This will be followed by a colon, and then I'll have the path, and this will also be specified as a string, so it will also be between quotation marks. Here I'll use the path for the ACES folder. I will need to replace the backslashes, and these can either be replaced with forward slashes, or I can double the backslashes. I personally prefer the forward slashes. I'm not going to use the entire path here. as we already have a lot of this path as an environment variable. So instead of specifying the path to the Renderman Pro server, I'll have a $sign, and then I'll have 2 curly braces, and then I'll use the Renderman tree environment variable between the curly braces. So this is the folder that I want to specify, and here I'm going to look for the config.ocio file. I can save the updated packages file, and then I'll restart Houdini. I do not see any errors showing up. In the viewport, I can look at the color correction. Here I now have an ACES profile showing up. If I look under the ACES config, we can see the ACES settings, and these settings are very rudimentary. As I stated previously, it would generally be a good idea to use an existing ACES profile, unless you are really sure of what you're doing with color management. I'll not be going into any more detail on this at the moment, as it is now working correctly, even if it is a very bare bones setup. I can now do a bit more of a thorough test. I'll add some geometry. I'm going to use the rubber toy. I'll also get a grid, and I'll get a sphere. I can reposition these within the scene. I'll get a LOPS network. I'll import my scene using a SOP import node. I'll also add an area light, and I can merge these together. I should now be able to use the Renderman XPU CPU renderer. I should be able to adjust the lighting. I'll add a point light for some basic backlighting. This is really horrible rendering and lighting, but the renderer is working, and I do now have a basic Renderman setup.